Hello, Mrs. McConnell and students. This is Chrissy Gregg here at the National World War II Museum down in New Orleans, Louisiana. I know it's hard for us to actually schedule some times to Skype with each other, so what Mrs. McConnell did, as you all know, is send me some questions that you guys had about the Holocaust. How I'm going to do this is, looks like we have about 13 questions, so I will send a video message for each question. So I'll repeat each question in the video message, and then I'll respond to it. We have about 3 minutes in each video message, so I'll try to get the answers done for each question in those 3-minute segments. And if you have any other questions, we can kind of communicate via email, and maybe if you want to send any video messages back. So that's how we'll do it today, and I hope you guys enjoy. All right, this is for the first question from Troy Gallo. He says, it seemed like no one knew about the camps even later in the war. So how were the Nazis able to hide the fact that they were transporting Jews to concentration camps and killing them? So there are a couple points here. That's a complicated question, and a lot of them are that you guys asked, which is really great. The reason there was some ability to hide what had happened is because as the war was going on and as the Allies were closing in on Germany from either side, the people running the camps, the SS, they were designated to destroy any evidence of the camp's existence as they were moving out of them and moving further into Germany. So that's why we see it. A lot of these camps, even some of what we consider the death camps, there is actually very little physical structures left because they were totally destroyed. So that's one of the reasons. I'm trying to think, let's see, there are probably questions. So, and I guess they were known about. Jewish people who were being put into ghettos, and they said the ghettos were being liquidated. From the testimony, at least that I've heard, they knew, didn't necessarily know all of the details, but they knew they were being sent somewhere that wasn't good, right? So there were already, I don't want to say they were rumors because they were certainly true. There were communications going about between the ghettos and the Jewish communities and people inside and outside of the ghetto as to what would be going on. So the Nazis never shouted it from the rooftops or anything like that, but there was a sense that these camps existed, that these things were happening within these Jewish communities and in the ghettos throughout the war. So that's kind of the short answer of it. All right, so this next question is from Mike. He says, if so many prisoners were brought in each day, why would the Nazis give sick existing prisoners an infirmary to heal if other weak prisoners are just executed? I don't have a tremendous amount of knowledge about actual infirmaries in most of these camps. So in some ways, to answer your question, a lot of these camps are different from one another. A death camp or a huge camp like Auschwitz runs a little bit differently than some of these smaller labor camps that were spread throughout Nazi-occupied territory. So some of them that were just strictly labor camps probably had different policies of how they dealt with prisoners who were ill than some of these larger death camps. To my knowledge, treatment if you got sick wasn't really available at the majority of these camps. From some of the oral histories that I've listened to and folks I've talked to, they say if you got sick with a disease like typhus, of course there is treatment that exists for that today and treatment back then, but you wouldn't be treated. So most people were just left to, if they were too sick to work, just essentially potentially even die in their beds they were sleeping in if they weren't actually killed by the Nazis. So to my knowledge, there wasn't a tremendous amount of care for sick prisoners. So on the whole, people, in addition to being murdered by the Nazis, were also died from starvation and died from disease during the Holocaust as well. Okay, the next question comes from Matt. He asks how many Jewish families tried to immigrate out of the countries controlled by the Nazi military so they would not be sent to concentration camps. That's a great question, and what I have for you instead of is like a verbal answer is I'm going to send a link to you all after this message is over, showing a map of the numbers of immigration outside of Germany to various different countries. So you can look at every specific country and where Jews were trying to escape. Okay, so Megan M. in question 4 asks, after the war was over and Jewish prisoners were set free, how did family members find each other and how did they know if they were alive or not? Did it take a long time to find each other and reunite, or was it easy and quick? It took a very, very long time for people to reunite. You can imagine the chaos of, World War II is ending. That doesn't mean just Jewish people trying to find their families and trying to figure out what happened. Many people in Europe who were displaced or maybe even fighting in the war, they're trying to make their way back home and trying to reestablish their lives. And of course, that includes the people who survived the Holocaust. What the Allies did is they set up what they called these DP camps, which were displaced person camps. And in those camps, it helped people try to, find their loved ones and their family members, and also try to figure out what to do next. For many people, in addition to finding family, also their homes were no longer existed, whether they were occupied by somebody else or their city could have been destroyed at some point. So it's reuniting with family, and it's also finding a home. So you can imagine how difficult that would be. Okay, so Mariah asks in this one, why were people so susceptible to Hitler's speeches when they must have known what he was doing was wrong? That's a really great question. To answer that, we need to consider what was going on in Germany before Hitler came to power. And in that case, Germany was going through, think about this is the 1930s, and just like many other countries in the world, Germany is going through a Great Depression. Also, if you guys have talked about World War I at all, you know that when the war ended, Germany had to sign this Treaty of Versailles, which technically, gave them a certain amount of war reparations. So things they had to do, because they were on the losing side of World War II. World War I. That also really affected Germany's economy. So people in Germany were really suffering. Many people were unemployed. Their money was pretty much worthless. And so that's when we see the rise of these radical groups like the Nazi Party, and people like Hitler and other individuals were saying, I have the solution for Germany. I can make Germany, what it once was. I can make Germany great again. So they weren't necessarily always, in the beginning at least, preaching these messages of hate. It was more preaching, putting these messages of greatness and of making Germany what it once was. They were making these promises. And so that's how, the Nazis and other radical groups began to gain followers. Okay, question 6, which actually doesn't have a name by it, so I'm not sure who asked, but it says, how many concentration camps were there in total? Were they located in multiple places where Germans had control, or just a certain part of Europe? There were actually 20,000 concentration camps set up by the Germans. Now, it wasn't just in Germany. It was really in any territory that the Nazis occupied over time. After this video message is over, there are many maps, but I'm going to send you one map showing some of the major camps throughout Europe. I think it's in the year of 1944. You can explore more maps like this. Actually, another really wonderful museum is the National Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and they have a lot of awesome resources. So that's some of the stuff I'm sending your way too throughout our discussion here. Okay, the next question comes from Jesse. Jesse asks, how old were the youngest kids that were sent to do labor? What specific work did they do? Um, Generally, it's not necessarily always about age. It's more about how old you may look. So when these camps, when the sorting process happens, you guys maybe talked about this in your class when they're trying to sort who will go into the work camp and who would go, to the gas chamber or whatever it may be. um, that they more decide. They don't ask how old you are. Oh, I'm 12. Oh, I'm 9. That kind of thing. They would the SS. They would kind of judge your age. So I would say generally around the age of 12 is when some kids may have looked old enough, or potentially even strong enough to be sent to do forced labor. Let's see. What specific work do they have to do? I think it depended on the camps because there were so many of them. In a very general sense, sometimes in these camps they were making equipment and supplies and whatnot for the German military. So the German military is at war, and you guys know any country that's war needs materials, needs supplies, needs weapons. And so sometimes in these camps they were making those sorts of things to supply the German military. All right, question 8 comes from Georgia. Georgia asks, what new technologies were used in World War II, and what part did they play in the war? We actually have an entire website here at the museum dedicated to just that topic. How these technologies developed, how are they used, and what they really mean for us today. So we could talk for hours, actually, about this, and I know we don't have that. So I'm going to send your teacher the website for you guys to explore. Some of the things just to mention are things like the V2 rocket, which Germans built, the computer. We have radar, jet engines. Let me see what else. What else am I missing? The Enigma machine, all the way to the atomic bomb. So I'm going to send you guys that website to explore after this video message. Okay, next comes from Lori, who asks, did all Germans support Hitler's plan for the persecution of the Jews? What would happen to those that didn't support Hitler's plan? The answer is no, not all Germans supported it. But as you probably are imagining by that kind of question you asked, is that if you're very outspoken of your dislike for Hitler and what he was doing and what the Nazis were doing and their policies, you potentially could become a victim yourself. And some people did stand up, and some people were persecuted or were sent to concentration camps. Not everybody, though. So it was a very difficult choice for people to make, even though they knew something was wrong. And so when I talk about the Holocaust, a lot of students, I talk about this idea of personal responsibility, that we all have a choice to make, to stand up for people who may be potentially different than us. And there could be a risk with that for sure. But the right choice is sometimes the most difficult choice, right? So unfortunately, that's why we don't see a tremendous amount of people stepping up and putting a stop to Hitler, because he had these policies that inspired, fear and fear of what the Nazis could do to you if you did say something and spoke out of turn. All right, Joe asks, how many non-Jewish civilians were killed in the Holocaust, and why were they killed if they were not Jewish? I think the numbers vary, but I think up to 5 million people who were not Jewish were killed by the Nazis during World War II. It can relate to kind of the question we were talking about, the last one that Lori asked, if you spoke out against the Nazi regime, could potentially be arrested and sent to a concentration camp as well. Hitler didn't just reserve his hatred for exclusively Jewish people. Hitler, unfortunately hated a lot of different people who he saw as, different from him or inferior or anything like that as he classified them. So that could include people of even different religions or faiths, like Jehovah's Witnesses. It could include like different ethnic groups like Jews or Slavs, or Poles or Slavs, even Russians as well. It could include Christians potentially too, people with mental disabilities, homosexuals. You'll see in these concentration camps there were certain, patches or insignia sometimes people had to wear that indicated why they were in that camp. And if you guys look that up, and I'll actually try to find it for you, you can see kind of the array of different people who were persecuted and how they would identify those people in the camps. I'll send that along next. Okay, James asks, how many Nazi soldiers were there, and how many of them were brought to justice after the Holocaust ended? So there were 10 million people at one point or another in the German military during World War II. That doesn't mean all of them were involved in the Holocaust, though, or technically committed what they call a war crime. They were just serving in the military. They had nothing really to do with rounding up Jews or murdering them per se. The idea of these trials or bringing them to justice is very complicated. There were people who were considered, criminals, that they committed these war crimes, and between 1945 and 46, many of these people who were considered major, war criminals, people who were running the concentration camps and high-ranking officials who made these decisions, were brought to trial. And there have probably been hundreds of trials since then of people who were lower ranking. I think in some ways they're still finding folks even to this day. So these trials haven't ended. I'm going to send to you all a couple resources after this video so you can explore these war crimes trials a little bit further in depth. But just know that not everybody who served in the German military was inherently guilty of a war crime. And so 10 million people were not tried. It was people who actually committed crimes against Jews or crimes against others during World War II. Okay, and then 12th message comes from Alex, who asks, how did the concentration camps go unnoticed for so long? If they were noticed earlier, how could no one do something about them? That's a great question. There was knowledge of these concentration camps. Actually, the United States knew about these death camps as early as 1942. I think it was February of 1942, and the U.S. just got involved in World War II technically in December of 1941. So pretty early on in the U.S.'s official involvement in the war. There are many reasons why these camps didn't get destroyed earlier on or whatever. One of them being, at least maybe in the case of the United States, the U.S. was focusing on more military operations versus this would be kind of considered like a humanitarian operation. Their goal in some ways was to get into Germany as quick as possible and, have Germany surrender. And they thought only then would these camps, be closed and or destroyed or what have you. If they decided to destroy a select camps, that would mean the Holocaust and the murder of Jews would still continue at other places. So the U.S. in some ways felt, the reason they didn't destroy these camps was they were focusing on the military operations to end the war as soon as possible, which would then close the camps. But it's complicated, and there are a lot of reasons behind why they weren't destroyed earlier as well, but that's just one of them. The last question comes from Nico asking, why did America give Nazi POWs citizenship to live in America after World War II ended? Why weren't they prosecuted in court? I don't have a tremendous amount of knowledge about that in particular, so I'm actually going to recommend for you to check out a book. It's called The Nazis Next Door. I'm going to send a link via Amazon if you really want to check it out and read it. And so it's about the Nazis living here, some of them very much secret after World War II. In a larger sense, some Nazis were, people were part of the Nazi Party or, had a major role in the German army or military during World War II, were brought here to the United States to do other things. Probably the best example is a guy named Werner von Braun. He made rockets for the German military during World War II. Well, after the U.S. realized they could potentially use this guy's talent. And so he was brought to NASA, and he helped develop the Apollo rocket, which would eventually send a man to the moon. So we see some of these Nazi scientists or other kind of officials who maybe did something in World War II that the U.S. saw as valuable and saw how they could maybe use it for themselves post-war, brought here to the U.S. to do those kinds of things. But on kind of a smaller scale, I'm not totally sure, and so that's why I'm going to send you a link to this book so you can explore it for yourself. Okay, Katie asks, how is it possible in the world that it says, how is it possible that the world had no idea what Hitler and the Nazis were doing? Millions of people were just disappearing and no one barely noticed. That technically isn't true, as we were talking about in the last questions. People did know about it, and it just maybe wasn't always reported in the media. Sometimes that kind of stuff, unfortunately, took like a second or third page compared to news of battlefronts and that sort of things. So that may be one of the reasons how the wider public maybe didn't have as much of a knowledge, but governments and countries and militaries and those high-ranking officials, they definitely knew what was going on. So it maybe wasn't always communicated to the wider public as much. The wider public didn't know as early as some of those high-ranking officials of certain countries. So that it technically isn't true that there was knowledge of what was happening in Nazi Germany. I will say though, the Nazis tried to keep secret what they were doing or keep quiet what they were doing as much as possible. But we know with military intelligence and things like that, and also you're right, these measures that were going on against Jewish people, whether putting them in the ghettos, eventually liquidating those ghettos to go to the camps, those are things that are going to get out, that sort of thing. Okay, next Alexandra asks, how many Jews were killed in each country? What percentage of pre-war Jewish population did they take up? I don't have the stats on each individual country in Europe. If I find that, I'll track it down and send it to you guys. But in general, there were 9 million Jews living in that eventually the territory that would be occupied by the Nazis during World War II. 6 million were killed in the Holocaust. If you do a math there, 2/3 of the Jewish population in that part of Europe were murdered during World War II and in the Holocaust. All right, Victor here has a more technical question about, military strategy. How did the weaponry and arsenal of the Nazis differ from other forces in the war? Also, what military tactics were used to advance to the concentration camps by the Allied forces? I can't speak to some of these more finer points of the military in depth, like weapons. But what I can tell you is any country the war was being waged in their own country, it was very difficult to produce supplies for your military. I think if you're being bombed or threatened, or those factories are being targeted, it's difficult then, if they're destroyed, or to then produce what you need. The U.S. actually was unique in some ways in this situation, and we use that term arsenal of democracy a lot here at the museum, because the United States, many of our factories were open 24 hours a day, sometimes 7 days a week, to churn out supplies that our military and other allied militaries needed, and we way outproduced any other country in most of all of the military supplies. So that's how, in some ways, the U.S. differs from a lot of other countries. What military tactics were used to advance to the concentration camps? So, with that one, again, I'm not like a tactical or military, kind of historian. So, but generally, I know sometimes the camps were just stumbled upon. The Allies maybe didn't know their exact location. They knew that these concentration camps existed, but sometimes the Nazis kept their locations relatively well hidden, or they tried to destroy the evidence of those camps even existing. So sometimes I think the Allies just kind of, as I said, stumbled upon them, surprised by what they found, and surprised by the survivors that they saw there. That probably wasn't always the case, but it was some of the time.